On the evening of November 5th, 1975, a crew of 7 loggers finished their work deep in the Apache Sitgreaves National Forest in Arizona. It had been a long day, and as they packed up their equipment and piled into their truck, they had no reason to believe that anything out of the ordinary would happen on their way home. But what they witnessed that night would become one of the most famous and controversial alien abduction cases in history. Travis Walton, a 22-year-old logger, was among them. The crew, led by foreman Mike Rogers, had been working under a government contract to clear timber. As the 7 men made their way down the winding forest road toward the town of Snowflake, a strange glow appeared through the trees. At first, they thought it might be the glow of a fire, but as they got closer, they saw it was something else entirely. Hovering in a clearing was a luminous disc-shaped craft. It was metallic, smooth, and eerily silent, emitting a bright blue light that illuminated the trees around it. The men were stunned, unsure of what they were seeing. The truck rolled to a stop. Without hesitation, Travis opened the door and stepped out. The others yelled for him to come back, but he kept walking, drawn to the strange craft. The blue light pulsed. The air was charged with a static electricity, a hum barely perceptible beneath the silence of the woods. Then, without warning, a powerful beam of light shot from the craft, striking Travis in the chest. His body was thrown backward, lifted off the ground as if hit by an invisible force. The men in the truck panicked. Thinking he was dead, they hit the gas and sped away, leaving him behind. It wasn't until several minutes later that guilt set in. Mike Rogers, the foreman, knew they couldn't just leave Travis. Gathering their courage, they turned the truck around and raced back to the clearing. But Travis was gone. The craft had vanished. The spot where he had been thrown to the ground was empty. There was no sign of a struggle, no trace of where he might have gone. He had simply disappeared. Fearing the worst, the crew drove to town and reported the incident to the Navajo County Sheriff's Office. Their story was met with skepticism. A missing man, a UFO sighting, it sounded like a hoax, or worse, an attempt to cover up something more sinister. The police suspected foul play. A search party was organized, combing the woods for any sign of Travis. Days passed. The authorities grew more convinced that the loggers were hiding something. The men were subjected to intense questioning and even polygraph tests. Each one told the same story, their fear genuine. They saw Travis Walton struck by a beam of light from an unknown craft, and then he was gone. The polygraph results were inconclusive for one and passed by the others. There was no evidence of a crime, but there was also no sign of Travis. Then, on the night of November 10th, 5 days after his disappearance, a call came in. A man claiming to be Travis Walton had been found. He was disoriented, frightened, and weak. He was discovered near a gas station in the small town of Heber, Arizona, more than 30 miles from where he was last seen. He had lost weight, was visibly shaken, and seemed genuinely traumatized. At first, he had no memory of what had happened to him, but as the days passed, fragments of a story emerged, one that was almost impossible to believe. He remembered regaining consciousness in a sterile, dimly lit room. Beings stood over him, small, humanoid figures with large, dark eyes. Their skin was pale, their expressions unreadable. He was immobilized, paralyzed with fear as they observed him. He struggled, panicked, and managed to break free. Stumbling through a corridor, he found himself in another section of what he believed to be a spacecraft. He encountered human-like figures, tall and dressed in strange uniforms, but they did not speak. They simply guided him back, and before he knew it, he blacked out again. The next thing he knew, he was on the side of the road, looking up at the night sky. His return should have ended the speculation, but instead, it fueled more controversy. Many refused to believe his story. Skeptics dismissed it as a hoax, claiming he and his crew fabricated the entire event for fame or financial gain. Others suggested he suffered from a psychological episode, experiencing hallucinations due to trauma. But then came more polygraph tests. Travis and the rest of the logging crew underwent examinations, and the majority passed, reinforcing their claims that they were not lying about what they saw. Years later, Travis would continue to stand by his story, repeating it in interviews, documentaries, and even inspiring the 1993 film Fire in the Sky. Debunkers have attempted to poke holes in the case, but the Walton abduction remains one of the most well-documented UFO encounters in history. Unlike other alleged alien abductions, this one had 6 eyewitnesses who all told the same account of what happened in those woods. Was Travis Walton really taken by a UFO? Was it a carefully orchestrated hoax? Or was it something even stranger, something beyond our understanding? Nearly 5 decades later, the questions remain, and the mystery of what happened to Travis Walton on that cold November night has never truly been solved. December 26, 1980, the early hours of the morning, a quiet, freezing night at RAF Woodbridge, a military base in Suffolk, England. The base, leased to the United States Air Force during the Cold War, was a secure and heavily guarded facility. But on this particular night, something was lurking beyond its fences, something no one could have expected. At around 3 a.m., military personnel on duty saw strange lights descending into the nearby Rendlesham Forest. At first, they thought it was a downed aircraft, possibly a crash landing. A small team, led by Sergeant Jim Peniston, was sent to investigate. As they moved through the thick woods, their radios crackled with interference. The air felt charged, electric, and then they saw it. Nestled among the trees was a triangular craft, metallic and smooth, unlike anything they had ever seen before. The object glowed with an unearthly light, red and blue hues pulsating along its surface. It emitted no sound. It simply sat there, hovering just above the forest floor. Sergeant Peniston, despite his training, found himself mesmerized. The air was thick, heavy with something unexplainable. As he moved closer, he reached out and placed his hand on the craft's surface. It was warm, vibrating beneath his touch. Strange symbols etched into the metal covered part of the hull. He traced his fingers over them, trying to understand what he was seeing. Then, in an instant, the object lifted off the ground. Without a sound, it ascended straight into the sky, vanishing in the blink of an eye. When the team returned to the base, they were shaken. Their watches seemed to be running slow, as if time had been distorted. The area where the craft had been spotted showed burn marks in the soil, broken tree branches, and increased radiation levels. Something had been there. But the events did not end that night. The following evening, Deputy Base Commander Lieutenant Colonel Charles Halt was called to the scene when more strange lights appeared over the forest. This time, he was determined to document everything. Armed with a tape recorder, Halt led a team into the woods. As they scanned the area with flashlights, their equipment malfunctioned. The radio signals cut in and out. Then, suddenly, they saw it again. A glowing red orb, weaving through the trees like an intelligent, controlled object. It moved in ways that defied physics, darting left and right, hovering, then splitting into multiple smaller lights. At one point, the light shot a beam of energy down toward the ground, narrowly missing the men. Halt recorded his observations in real time. His voice, calm but tense, can still be heard in the now famous Halt tape, an audio recording of the incident that remains one of the most compelling pieces of UFO evidence in history. The following are a few seconds of Lieutenant Colonel Halt's recordings. You can listen to the entire tape recording on Wikipedia.
At about 10 degrees horizon directly north, we've got two strange objects
lights continued for hours before disappearing once again into the sky. When daylight came, the military conducted an official investigation. The site where the craft first landed was examined. Radiation readings were taken and found to be significantly higher than normal. Trees were scorched. The soil beneath where the object had hovered was oddly compacted, as if something heavy had pressed down on it. Despite the physical evidence and multiple testimonies from highly trained U.S. Air Force personnel, the event was quickly dismissed by officials. The British Ministry of Defense downplayed the incident, attributing the lights to a misidentified lighthouse beacon in the distance. But this explanation made little sense to those who had been there. A lighthouse doesn't hover, split into multiple lights, or shoot beams toward the ground. For decades, the Rendlesham Forest incident has been called Britain's Roswell, one of the most well-documented and controversial UFO encounters in history. Sergeant Penniston, years later, would reveal something even more bizarre. After touching the craft, he claimed that a series of binary code sequences had flooded into his mind. Numbers and symbols that he later wrote down in a notebook. When these codes were analyzed, they appeared to contain coordinates to various sites around the world, including the Great Pyramid of Giza and the Nazca lines in Peru. Some believe this suggests the object wasn't extraterrestrial, but something else entirely, possibly a time-traveling vehicle from the future. Others think it was a secret military experiment gone wrong. Skeptics argue that the entire event was misinterpreted, that stress, environmental conditions, and overactive imaginations fueled the hysteria. But the witnesses, men who trained for combat and critical decision-making, never changed their stories. To this day, no official explanation fully accounts for what happened in the Rendlesham Forest on those cold December nights. It began in the night sky over Belgium. A quiet evening in November 1989 would mark the start of one of the most well-documented and puzzling UFO encounters in modern history. Over the next several months, thousands of people, including police officers, military personnel, and even government officials, would witness something extraordinary. They called it the Belgian UFO wave. The first reports came from the town of Eupen, near the German border. 2 police officers on routine patrol noticed something hovering in the sky above a field. It was large, silent, and triangular in shape, with bright white lights at each corner and a pulsating red light in the center. The craft seemed to float effortlessly, defying gravity. Without warning, it moved. The officers watched in stunned silence as the object glided smoothly across the sky, far too slow for any conventional aircraft. Then, in an instant, it accelerated and vanished over the horizon. Within hours, other reports flooded in. Witnesses across the region described seeing the same thing, a massive, dark, triangular craft moving through the night with an unnatural silence. Some claimed to have seen it hovering just above treetops, while others reported that it shot off at impossible speeds, disappearing in the blink of an eye. By the time 1990 arrived, the sightings had not only continued, they intensified. On March 30th, 1990, something happened that would make the Belgian UFO wave one of the most credible mass sightings in history. That night, the Belgian Air Force scrambled 2 F-16 fighter jets to intercept an unknown radar contact moving erratically over the country. Ground-based radar operators picked up the craft moments earlier. Its movements were unlike anything they had ever seen. The jets locked onto the target. Then, in an instant, it accelerated to over 1,000 miles per hour, dropping thousands of feet in seconds. The pilots struggled to keep up, but each time they tried to engage, the object would outmaneuver them effortlessly, making sharp turns that should have been physically impossible. For over an hour, the pilots attempted to intercept the craft. Each time it slipped away, vanishing from radar, only to reappear in another location moments later. It was as if the object knew it was being followed. On the ground, civilians watched in shock. Police officers, trained observers, reported seeing the triangular craft silently hovering over towns and highways. It did not resemble any known military aircraft. It made no sound. It did not behave like anything from this world. In an unprecedented move, the Belgian government acknowledged the incident. The Air Force confirmed that their jets had engaged an unidentified flying object, one that exhibited flight characteristics beyond known technology. But they had no explanation. Unlike other countries, where UFO reports were often dismissed or covered up, Belgium took an open approach. The Minister of Defense himself publicly stated that something truly unknown had entered Belgian airspace. Next came the photograph. One of the most famous UFO images ever captured emerged from the Belgian wave. A grainy but clear photo of a black triangular craft with glowing white lights at each corner. The image was studied by experts and deemed authentic with no evidence of manipulation. It became the defining visual of the Belgian UFO phenomenon. But not everyone was convinced. Some skeptics suggested that what people saw was nothing more than misidentified military aircraft. They pointed to the possibility of experimental stealth bombers such as the US B-2 Spirit being tested in European airspace. But this theory had one major flaw. The Belgian government itself had confirmed that no military aircraft were operating in the area at the time. Others proposed that atmospheric conditions, psychological factors, or even mass hysteria played a role. But that did little to explain the multiple radar detections, the military engagement, and the sheer number of trained witnesses, including law enforcement officers and pilots, who all reported seeing the same thing. Unlike most UFO cases, which rely on a handful of eyewitness accounts, the Belgian UFO wave involved thousands of people, multiple radar stations, police departments, and even fighter pilots, all describing the same object, behaving in ways no known aircraft could. Decades later, the Belgian UFO wave remains one of the most compelling and well-documented mass UFO sightings in history. No official explanation has ever been provided. For those who saw it, there is no question. Something extraordinary happened in the skies over Belgium, and whatever it was, it's still unidentified.